Treaty Talks is a podcast series designed to have an open conversation with experts about matters relating to Te Tiriti of Waitangi. He mea whakamatuku e nei kōrero I ētahi wā. But we shouldn't be afraid of having these conversations, as they are an essential step in this great nation-building experience. Ko te manuhiri I te rangi nei, ko whaia Ella Henry.
If we do not learn from history, we're condemned to relive it.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand that we have a history made up of not two races, but two nations. The Māori nation existed prior to the treaty. It engaged in a treaty with another nation. And if you look at the Te Tiriti, the last few words of the first clause, where we tuku atu ki te kuini o Ingarangi, the rangatiratanga o rātou whenua, not mātou whenua, not tātou whenua, rātou whenua. We knew exactly what we were signing. We gave to her the right to govern her lands.
Ko whaia ala tētahi o ngā tino waha kōrero I ēnei kaupapa. Ka mutu, he whakamāma I ngā kōrero kia mārama ai ki te hunga kore mōhio. I te Māori kura, I te iho pūmanua, Ella Henry, nau mai, raro mai. Thank you so much for taking the time out to come and have a kōrero with us for this kaupapa.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nunui.
I te tuatahi whakamārama mai, kia mātou ko waikoe.
Ko Ngātikahu ki Whangaroa, rātou ko Ngāti Kuri me Te Rārawa o ku iwi, no muri whenua ahau, no kaitaia, no ahipara, the centre of the universe.
E hei ki a koe, according to you.
He urban Māori a nainei. Nō reira ka huri au ki te reo tuarua. Kia ora.
Yeah. I do want to start with the mahi that you do. For a long time you have been an urban Māori, you've been in the teaching space, working at universities as an educator. Can you tell us a bit about that mahi?
Well, I think I'm very privileged to be 70 and have a job that I still love passionately, because I started very late. I got kicked out of school when I was 15.
Why'd you get
so I had
kicked out of
no
school?
formal education but I travelled and I learnt. One of the things I used to say when I first came home was that it was easier to be a Māori woman in Paris than in Māngere. Because in Paris, we're exotique.
Yeah.
In Māngere, we're just hories.
Yeah.
Right? So I had a lot of baggage that I was dealing with, and so I was very late starting university because I came home, realised that I had no education, and the most that I could aspire to was to become a teacher, because that was the flashiest job that any Māori I ever knew had.
Yeah.
And I've managed to turn that into my career for the last. I started in 1986, so nearly 40 years I've been able to research and teach about my people and who I am. All my research has been about who we are as Māori, what we are as Māori, how we got to be here, why we are in the situation we're in, and that's a privilege.
Yeah, which actually makes you a perfect guest for this episode, because we do want to talk about our people and how we got here and all the things that have happened to us in the past, but also kind of deconstruct some of those myths that have been spread about us for a really long time, which is something you have a lot of kōrero about.
Well, let's be very clear. Our history was constructed after the treaty by white anthropologists who just, and white missionaries who wrote stories about us so the lens that we began to see ourselves through was a very Eurocentric one. So that by the time I was born in the 1950s, my parents had been utterly colonised, and I genuinely mean this. We would walk down the street in Kaitaia, and if a white man came toward us, we would step aside.
Wow.
We were broken in the 1950s. So the fact that here we are in 2024 and I do not live in that country anymore, and my mokos will not have to grow up in that country, means that we have made huge changes because of who and what we are. We're so smart and resilient and brave, and for 5,000 years, we are part of a people who looked at the horizon and saw opportunity instead of dragons. That's in our DNA, and 184 years of systematically trying to undermine that view of ourselves almost broke us. But it didn't, because we are resilient and brave.
Yeah. Māori haven't been allowed to control their own narratives. Whaeala and many others have worked hard to get us to a point where we can take ownership of our stories and reclaim control of our narrative.
So can you actually talk to me a little bit about what we were like before tohu came? He hanga āhuatanga o te ao Māori, I mua I te tainga mai o tauiwi.
Okay, so I just had my DNA done.
Oh,
quite late
yeah?
in life, and I found out I'm 75 or 73% Austronesian. So that's the name 1, 2, 3. Those of us of the Austronesian diaspora, Tonga, Fiji, Samoa.
Oh, that's the name for it, Austronesian.
We have a name. Here, some white man gave us this name, Austronesian diaspora. Anywho, what it does mean is that I have 73% of me that is part of this connection of tangata moana. 1% is South American native. So maybe 20 generations ago, one of my tupuna made it all the way to Peru and came back not just with a kumara, but a dusky maiden. That fills me with great joy.
Yeah.
Because as the kumara passed its, and that's what it's called in that language, as it passed its way across the Pacific, so did we, until we came here maybe 1,000 years ago, who's counting? Long enough to name every mountain, every tree, every bird. Some names we gave were the same ones we used in other places, but a lot of them were brand new. You know, so we were literally scientists. And I heard recently that one of the reasons we kept the kiore on the waka was because, as pets, was because when we would find an island, we would let the kiore go because they smell water.
Wow.
And if they came back, no water. Hasta la vista, babies, we're on our way. And if they went, we'd go, oh, kapai, we've got more in the boat. This is a nice place. So that's science. So when people try to convey this image that we were savages and lost and we just stumbled upon this place, all of our science denies that.
Yeah.
The navigation by the stars, by the planets, the knowledge that is embedded in our mātauranga. And so that's what we brought to Te Tiriti.
Yeah.
Our science, our knowledge, and our partnership. And we expected the same from our partner.
Yeah. But that's not what happened.
That is not what happened, and for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure you'll discuss at length with many others. But, you know, the fundamental difference between the treaty and Te Tiriti and how that fits for me into a trajectory of Māori thinking going back to Hakaputanga in 1835, which was a trade document. I mean, we knew after that ship had been impounded in Sydney in 1831 because we didn't have a flag, we knew the Aussies just wanted everything that was inside. I mean, if you have a look at Hazel Petrie's book, we produced 34,000 pounds worth of manufactured goods that we sold into Sydney in 1831 when you could buy a ship for 500.
Yeah.
That's Māori commerce. That's Māori enterprise. And so when we lost that ship because it wasn't flying a flag of nationhood, guess what we did? We created a nation.
Yeah.
And we created it using a very sophisticated model called federalism. Because federalism allows every tribe to have tino rangatiratanga, but for you still to be part of a nation, like America, like Australia.
Yeah.
And because Hongi Hika had been to Cambridge University, that's how that works as well. Every college in Cambridge is its own tino rangatiratanga state. That takes sophistication. That takes intelligence. These are not a people who 4 years later give it all away because some white man turns up.
And these are beautiful stories of how we viewed the taiao and how, you know, we knew about commerce, we knew about trade. But what was the narrative and what were the stories that were actually being told about us?
Look, the reality is the convenience of being able to perceive of the First Nation people as savages. And you know, we've heard about the importance and significance of the doctrine of discovery, the papal bull that allowed the colonisers to civilise the uncivilised. So the agenda has always been from European imperialism, whether it's the English or the French or the Belgians or the Germans, you know, the belief, the implicit belief in white supremacy that underpinned imperialism in the 18th and 19th century has had devastating impacts, not just on us, but millions of Indigenous people around the world. And the same consequences we're seeing, which is entrenched intergenerational poverty and trauma, a complete lack of self-determination. And so the work that's been going on as part of the Māori Renaissance in the last 50 years, which I love, Ranginui Walker gave it that name, that has fundamentally changed not only Te Ao Māori, but Aotearoa.
I heard you briefly mention the doctrine of discovery, which is something I hear people talk about a lot, but I actually have no idea what that is, as I'm sure many people who are watching, listening don't. Can you kind of simplify what that is for us?
Well, I'm not an expert on it by any means, but there are people in Te Ao Māori who are. But I'm aware that particularly after Columbus came back, and I mean, let's be very clear, our Native American friends are called Indians because he was lost. He thought he was in India.
Wow, I've never heard that.
Well,
whakapapa to that name before.
I mean, that's the only reason he called them Indians, because he thought he was in India. And so he came back, and the Pope at the time, from what I understand, you know, there are savages there, so we have to give to our discoverers. They've discovered this land that had been populated for 50,000 years. They discovered it. And so the doctrine of discovery gave them the right to civilize the uncivilized at whatever cost.
Wow.
And so the genocide of the Americas, the expropriation of the wealth of Africa and Asia were all somehow glossed over as being civilizing the uncivilized.
The doctrine of discovery is a crazy thing. Have a Google. Ara anō e tahi Māori kuruku hōhonu atu ki ngā kōrero mo te doctrine.
And so that's, I think, part of the agenda that was written into our history. And when you have that rammed down your throat for 4 generations, which it was, I mean, my great-great-grandfather was born in 1828. But by the time my father was born in 1919, he had already grown into a world that we'd lost everything. You know, so my parents, I've said it, tried to give us the most English-sounding names.
Yeah.
They just couldn't do anything about the big nose and the brown skin, you know, because and that was not cruelty on their part. They genuinely believed that they were giving us an opportunity to survive and do better, and that's why they moved to the city. You know, I mean, I was born in Ahipara. If you've had a chance to see Ahipara, you know how beautiful that is.
Yeah.
And then you come to the city and you're just part of this urban migration of dislocated people trying to find our way in the world. And we did, because we are resilient and brave.
And it is interesting what you say about people's names. Even in my whānau, we've got a Lancelot, a Reginald, a Douglas. I'm like, what kind of names are those?
Well, we were Catholic, so the Ngātikahu, so we've all got French Marist saints' names. Henry, St. Henry, St. Paul, St. Martin.
And that is really indicative of the time, eh? And even my friends now, all the kind of next generation are all giving their tamariki Māori names and reclaiming that back, which is amazing.
Which is beautiful. And what's more, those kids are brave and strong enough to say to people how to pronounce them correctly. You know, my baby Merenia, from the age of 5, she would go, Merenia, insistently.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that because that's not the world I was born in. And I'm very proud to have been part of a movement of people making those changes through education, through research, through advocacy, through using every public opportunity I have to say we've survived. And guess what? We've added something really special to your identity. Even if you're not Māori. I mean, you go to London and you see another New Zealander and you've got your pounamu on and they're going to go, kia ora, because they're proud of it too.
Yeah.
So it's a very odd time when it feels like there is so much negativity being directed at our culture, our language, our identity.
Yeah. Back then, when all the colonisers came, was there also that kind of narrative that we just weren't even clever enough to have deliberately discovered Aotearoa and that we just floated here on a piece of wood?
You look at that painting that's in the art gallery in Auckland of the ravaged, desperate souls on a canoe in the storm finding respite. I mean, that was a very Eurocentric view because it justified what they did. And after the New Zealand Constitution Act of 1852 gave settlers the right to set up their own government, basically the British Crown were a little bit busy, with wars in Europe, so they didn't want to be administering yet another colony. Let's let them take care of themselves. So the first thing they did after that, you see, after 1852, the repressive legislation. A particular one I always feel very strongly about, it's the Oyster Fisheries Act of 1862.
Okay.
Law is made in Wellington.
Yep.
But if you're selling oysters, and who's selling oysters? Māori. And if you're selling oysters without a licence, you get arrested.
Really?
And if you get arrested and you cannot pay the fine, you go to jail or you have to sell land.
Wow.
You think about, the Native Language Act, just all of this legislation that just came out, the beginnings of the invasions into the King Country, so that by 1858, the kotahitanga is the body that is formed to protect our people by being able to speak to kotahitanga through kingitanga.
Yeah.
It didn't work because they were, as I said, a little preoccupied with their own wars in Europe, and they threw us to the hounds.
I've never heard, I've heard about the main bills like the Tohunga Suppression Act and all of the ways in which the government tried to oppress us, but that oyster one is just out the gate.
It's just the little pieces. The dog tax is what set off the war in the north. So if you owned a dog, you had to pay a tax. And this was in the you know what I mean? So we've had to be resilient enough to cope with all of the onslaught. Because from the day we started saying no to land sales, the aggression really ratcheted up. The invasions, the warmongering. And, we've just seen it recently in some of the films that have been made by our people for our people, that are just peeling back the layers. And that's making some New Zealanders uncomfortable. But my view is if we do not learn from history, we're condemned to relive it.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand that we have a history made up of not two races, but two nations. The Māori nation existed prior to the treaty. It engaged in a treaty with another nation. And if you look at the Te Tiriti, the last few words of the first clause, where we tuku atu ki te kuini o Ingarangi, the rangatiratanga o rātou whenua, not mātou whenua, not tātou whenua, rātou whenua. We knew exactly what we were signing. We gave to her the right to govern her lands.
Ko hoki anō tātou ki au kōrero. Māori wanted the Queen to come over and govern her own people. Kaore tātou I tuku I te mana ki iaia kia whakahaere I te katoa o te whenua.
And you talk about how we kind of were operating before, before Tohu arrived, and they said it was just kind of, like a mess, and we were savages and we weren't managing ourselves and we didn't know what we were doing. But that's not true, right?
Absolutely not. And in fact, many of the early missionaries, if you read some of their reports, in the very early days when if you wanted to live here, you had to learn the Māori language right up until, the 1860s and 70s, they were enormously impressed by the fact that we had ablution areas, we had rubbish areas, we were healthy, we were fit, we were robust. And in fact, if you ever want to find out how interesting we were, you should read the English translation of de Surville's journals, because Cook and Banks were much more interested in looking at birds and trees, and the French were looking at breasts. And writing about how ugly the women were because they were so savage. But this is it. This is a European who's used to demure. You know, at that time, women were chattels in Europe.
Yeah.
They were belongings, unless they managed to crawl over glass to get to the top by marrying a king. They were pieces of property. So what you see in their interpretation of us is mana wahine. We were ferocious.
And because that is indicative of our whakaaro as Māori and how important women have always been, because without them you don't have a whakapapa, like, ka mutu, mehe mea ka mate rātou.
Our cosmology is the foundation of our culture, and our cosmology is predicated on rangi nui, rawa, ko papa tuanuku, right? Instead of our father, it's our mother and our father who are our primary deities, and we exist in the bosom of their love for each other. And that's my cosmology. I'm not a Christian, and I'm not being negative because I know many of my whānau are, but I'd proudly call Māoritanga my religion.
Yeah, and I think lots of people would too.
And it's my culture. It's all there. All of the principles of living well, that meant we didn't need to have a government. We didn't need to have taxes. We didn't need to have hospitals. We didn't need to have law. Tikanga, that which is tika, guided our actions. And yes, there was war, as there has been in every single culture, but we have a lot more words for peace than we do for war in our language. Manaki, aroha, kotahitanga, all of the whakawhanaungatanga, all of those words about how do we broker peace. And at the end of a war, which I sometimes think was probably just a bunch of young men that we'd sent over the hill because of some hara from long ago to get them out of the village while they were, as I used to call my teenagers, hungry, hairy and horny. So you send them over the hill and hopefully they come back with the missus. And then we never have to worry about that village over the hill anymore.
If you get the chance to read some of the early settlers' journals, it gives you a very clear picture of how they looked down on anyone who wasn't the same as them.
What were, have you read a lot of those kind of early writings from the missionaries and how they portrayed life here in Aotearoa?
So I've just finished writing a case study for the Manawahine claim around one of my tupuna from Te Rārawa, Eleonora. So she was one of the 13 women who signed Te Tiriti. And so after the Te Tiriti left Waitangi, it sailed up to Awanui, and Panakarea was the well-known chief from there, and she was his wife. So they would have said, oh, you can't sign it. But I know from a lot of Te Rārawa women I know that she would have none of that. So she signed it, absolutely. And then 8 years later, she was on her deathbed. And this was from missionary news of the day. And they considered her a terrible woman because she spoke to her husband in a most ferocious way. And he had come back from his travels with a new wife.
Oh.
And she pulled a shotgun out. She was on her deathbed and shot the woman. Not to kill her.
Go, get it, sis.
Just to let her know, hey, wait till I'm gone.
Yeah.
And then when her funeral came about, it was revealed that she actually owned all the land.
Right.
So that was 1848, when Manawahine was still intact. But remember, we were colonised not just by imperialism and capitalism, but also by patriarchy. So our men have done okay in some regards out of patriarchy.
It's a little bit.
Just saying.
But even when they arrived too, Māori didn't even have a written language.
No.
Right? We weren't writing things.
Can you imagine the capability of reciting hundreds of years of knowledge in Oriori, in Waiata, in Whaikōrero, and having to get, and Wero, having to get every single inflection right generation after generation. That's our brains were our libraries. And we have an extraordinary capacity for retentive memory. Yeah.
And then annoying that the first thing that got translated was the Bible, right?
Well, I mean, they were the first to arrive en masse. I always think 1814 was the year the first missionaries came, and their agenda at that stage was to placate the natives, to make friends with the natives, but also to convert them. And the best way to convert them was the threats of hellfire and damnation if you were uncivilized and ungodly.
Yeah.
And remember, and I'm somewhat apologetic about this because I do have Ngāpuhi roots. And I know that when Hongihika came back from Cambridge in 1820, that he traded all his gifts that they'd earned in England for guns and waged war. But the problem about that is whoever gets the weapon of mass destruction first is going to behave badly until everybody else has a weapon of mass destruction. But that was an ugly period in our history when a lot of, I think, tribal antipathies were settled instead of through peacemaking. They were settled through musketry.
Yeah.
And so I think that by the 30s we'd realised warfare was not going to unite us. It had to be trade. And so the Hakaputanga of 1835 and the treaty, I think, are both trade documents. Any smart trader aligns with the biggest player in the market. And in 1840, the British were the biggest players in the market, followed closely by the French. So there was a lot of vying between those two, and that's part of the reason why Hobson came here, was because, you know, there were some tribes liaising with the French. And that's a personal affront to the British if another colony should go to the French. So, you know, we were bit players in international realpolitik.
Yeah, and then kind of, did we end up trading, or did they just come here and then take all the trading away from us?
Well, I mean, none of that happened so quickly. I mean, keep in mind that if you wanted to send a letter in 1841, Māori owned the only postal service because we knew the roads to everywhere.
My grandpa and my grandmother both met when they were working for the post.
I mean, my grandfather, who was Irish, came to the gum fields in the 1890s and met my grandmother, and he had to learn to speak Māori fluently because everybody who worked in the gum fields had to speak Māori.
Yeah.
So when you married a white man, you had two choices. You could go white, or he'd have to go native. Those were the only choices.
Like my great grandfather was Irish too. I wonder if they came over on the same waka.
So you know, even till the turn of the century, our world was still a bit broken but intact. But my view is that by the 20th century, the early 1900s, you know, many of our tribes were down to very small numbers. There was no work. The gum fields was back-breaking work. It was horrific. And I remember my mother and my father met in the gum fields and, you know, spending all day up to your thighs in water with a stick, tamping through the swamps to find the sound of gum, and then being paid a pittance for it so that it could be turned into shellac. You know, so we became slaves in our own country very quickly, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's so sad.
It could have been, but it didn't become tragic. And the reason it didn't is because of the enduring resilience of our people. And I keep stressing that over and over again. Our people have survived much worse than the last few years. You know, we survived disease, war, poverty, and we've come through with grace and dignity.
I do wonder, though, how all these really negative narratives can affect our wairua and our hinengaro and how we think about ourselves, especially back then too. It must have been a devastating time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the worst of that is gone. And I say that as somebody who was very fortunate to be at Waitangi in 2024 at Waitangi when 50,000 people turned up on February the 6th. Over half of them were not Māori. And they were all wearing, you know, I stand with Māori, proud to be a Māori, toi tū te tiriti, tangata tiriti. And this is a movement that cannot be stopped by a short term of negative legislation. Right? This train has left the station. There are as many non-Māori as Māori learning te reo. There are as many non-Māori as Māori embracing the culture, haka. You know, haka is just groundbreaking.
Yeah, it's been so good. Matatini is just,
it's off the
phenomenal,
charts.
yeah.
It's absolutely, and you know, 1 million views from around the world, and people who come here and they have automatically we have a porphyry for them, and they're moved to tears.
Yeah.
Because when spirits touch, it's not just noses that are touching, it's spirits. And then those spirits are fed. And if you are living in a spiritual vacuum and you encounter people that live in that spiritual realm, then that makes you want to be part of that.
It does annoy me sometimes, though, that we are so revered overseas and around the world, but then we can't even get people here to support us a lot of the time.
I mean, I think, look, by 2030, we're 1 million people now. By 2030, it's assumed we'll be, 1.2 million, and the majority of our population is under 30. So we're a young people. And I see it, as I said, at the beginning, I'm privileged to be able to still be teaching and around rangatahi. And I see in the young Māori of the future that our future is intact. That our babies with their long, unpronounceable Māori names and their sassy attitudes towards their reo and our culture are so prevalent and so a part of the fabric of this society that it's unchangeable.
Yeah. It kind of does indicate that our history is more than just the past 185 years, right?
Absolutely, and we bring all of it. This is what we bring to the table. People travel 12,000 miles to come to our country to have the culturally authentic experience of meeting us. And that's a part of what we bring to this nation. So when we are strong and resilient, our economy is strong and resilient. When you attack us and make us unemployed, you're just costing the economy. It's not actually working for anybody.
Yeah. And you've been teaching for a long time now. Have you seen attitudes change over that time? What are your students like in terms of how they're engaging with the things that you're teaching?
I mean, I live in I talk about how I was born in a different country to the one I'm living in now.
Yeah.
And we have rebuilt from the ground up language, culture, identity, resilience. And I think of my heroes, people like, Hana Tehemera, who was a nanny to my kids. These teeny tiny little women who just were utterly fearless. And just seeing her and those queer up at Takaparafo and Eva Rickard, I mean...
My grandmother.
Oh, I loved her. I loved her.
Same.
So I just feel like I stand on the shoulders of these giants and all I can do is try to make sure that I'm a good ancestor for the people who one day will stand on mine.
That's beautiful. Whaia, are there any myths that you would like to debunk about Māori and what we were like and who we were?
I think the most damaging mythologizing is around how our science is myth. The myth about myth. Their cosmology is truth and our cosmology is myth. But actually, our cosmology is science, incredibly sophisticated science that knows when tides change, when fish migrate, when birds don't just fly off the earth.
Yeah.
When they go somewhere and come back, there's a good reason for it. So you watch. We are incredibly attentive when we're allowed to be, when we're not having to worry about looking over our shoulder in fear.
And just even proof of that is the hononga ki ngā ingoa Māori. When you look at the Māori names for things, even our place names, there might be a place and it's called, from the name you can say, I can't swim in that river because you'll drown, or like the currents are really strong, and all of those things indicate.
There's a taniwha here. There's you know what I mean? All of that is science. That's not mythologizing or stories. That's be careful, kia tūpato, he piko, he taniwha, you know what I mean? I mean, all of it is woven into the story and the narrative. So you don't need to have complex formulae. It's handy, I guess, for some stuff, but we didn't need it. we used story and narrative to talk about, when Matariki arises, that's when we can do this. When those two stars come together, that's when we go in that direction. So that takes centuries of observation and passing on that information. And whakapapa is the foundation of that. You follow the path of everyone that you came from, but also the places. So all of those names, they're not just words like North Island and South Island.
Or just places that are named after random people that came here and their last name. Or
who was Nelson?
Yeah, exactly. Who was
Auckland?
Lord Picton? He was a slave trader. I know that much.
Yeah.
And all of our Māori names have so much more. He hōhonu ake ngā whakaro ki era ingoa.
Look at Rangi Toto, right? Blood. So can you imagine when our people saw that island come out of the ocean and wipe out everybody, which is why Motu Tapu is called that? I mean, can you imagine? Of course, Maui fished the island up because we saw another one coming up.
Yeah.
And that gets woven into the story of how we live in this place and Waitamata and Waitaruke and all of these beautiful names that tell you about the story of the origins and the people that were important. Karangahape. And we call it K Road. Tragic.
Te Tiriti and the principles have been brought to the surface in the last 12 months. Conversations about Te Tiriti are no doubt necessary. It seems, as always, things are out of balance though.
So obviously this podcast is about the treaty.
Yes, sorry.
No. Kei te pai. Kia ha o whakaro mō ngā nekehanga e pāna ki te tiriti I e nei rā. Like, what are your thoughts about what's happening with the treaty and that conversation currently?
I mean, the Treaty Principles Bill, and it is still just a bill, and we have been assured by the Prime Minister that his party will not support it. Who knows what will happen? My main concern about a piece of legislation like that is how powerfully persuasive the arguments for it may sound, but when you unpick them and when you look at the actual wording of the bill, even our own Justice Department is saying it's problematic and it's about rewriting the content of the treaty, which I think is being divisive and enabling an upsurge of negativity towards Māori people and Māori culture, which I think is problematic. But as I said right from the outset, and I want to reiterate, we've survived worse. We've survived worse, and we're still here, and our babies are still here, and our mokos are still here, and 1,000 years from now we'll still be here.
Amongst all that, we have been colonized. How do we go about decolonizing ourselves?
I remember when I started my master's journey, which was about 30-something years ago, at the time I was a very angry 40-something because I'd just learnt my history and I was very grumpy. Now I'm just grumpy because I'm old. But 30 years ago, my agenda was deconstructing the colonization of my mind. And that's a life's work, right? But it's a really cool thing to do. So every time I look at something and I think, oh, that's beautiful. I go, why do I think that's beautiful? Because I've been programmed to believe that you have to be thin and young and white and tall and have blue eyes to be beautiful. Unpick that. We are women of substance. Guess what? I'm still alive. I'm still healthy. We have, intergenerational households. Okay, yes, that's a problem if it's an unhealthy house, but we also have intergenerational families. And I see, some of my older Pākeha women friends my age who don't see their children because they've gone to live elsewhere, who don't get an opportunity to hang with their mokopuna all the time. And I think, you know what? We've still managed to hold on to whānau. we've still managed to hold on to whakawhanaungatanga as an intrinsic part of who and what we are, and that is what's giving that next generation strength. So whilst these are troubling times on some levels, certainly globally, I mean, climate change is the major issue facing the planet.
Yeah.
Papa Tongarewa is bleeding.
And hey, if they listen to Māori and ngā iwi takitaki o te ao, maybe
And
they
our
would find a
Aboriginal
solution
friends
to
in
that. Yeah.
Australia and our First Nations peoples of all the Americas have been saying the same thing. Our Mother the Earth is bleeding. So that's the real problem that we should be looking at, not how we reword the treaty so that a few discombobulated, disenfranchised, grumpy people can feel more secure in their culture and identity.
Ko te mea pai, kua maia te ao Māori. Kua kaha te tū ki te ao nei, me whakahihi pai tātou I tērā.
Well, I mean, I love the fact that we were all talking about it and thinking about it.
Yeah.
I love the fact that our real history was on the threshold of being introduced to schools and may not happen for a bit longer.
Yeah.
So I don't think there is anything new for us. I think what's important is that we are having these conversations, that you are telling these stories,
Yeah.
that we are part of the discourse, that we are not just a subject of it, but we are an author of the discourse. And that's the best thing about any threat to Te Tiriti is it wakens the taniwha in all of us.
Aotearoa 2040, hiaha o wawata. What would you like to see happening then?
Okay, well, I probably won't be here because, the stats for Māori mortality rates. So I don't think I'll be around, but I might be, who knows. And if I am, what I'd like to see is a much more connected tangata moana. Right, so we, the people of the Pacific, are going to be the majority population in this country by 2040. Māori, tangata whenua, tangata moana. We're going to be the biggest ethnic group.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd like to see by 2040 is we've resolved our relationships with each other and that we are speaking in a united voice, not just here in Aotearoa, but across the Pacific. Because I know that there's mamai in Tahiti, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Rarotonga, there's mamai, and we are going to be dealing with climate refugees very soon whose countries are under threat.
Yeah.
So how we unite and how we move forward is what I hope most for 2040, that it will be a brown, beautiful 200-year celebration.
Ali Henry, e mihi nui ana ki a koe. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your beautiful whakaaro and your beautiful kōrero with us. It's so amazing to have, someone with such incredible mātauranga like yours on our kaupapa. So e mihi ana ki a koe.